I'm Mark Timnitsky. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, as well as an accredited freelance journalist covering Eurasian affairs, and I've been covering the region for almost a decade. And I also discuss how Eurasia impacts U.S. and European foreign policy, national security, and energy security.
We always like to do these issue you should care about interviews focusing on sort of the beginning part, the context, if you will. So if you could start, could you detail the kinds of impact that foreign policy tends to have on US elections?
So during the 1960s and early 1970s, the United States, of course, was sending soldiers to Vietnam. So Vietnam was a large voting issue during that period, and then more so during the early 2000s when the United States invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. But aside from that, for most American voters, it's mostly domestic issues that they focus on. Foreign policy is not as prominent as issues that Americans would think about, such as the economy, education policy, border security, abortion rights, and other matters pertaining to everyday activity here in the United States.
This year, there are a few major foreign policy issues that are in play with this election, and we're going to start with the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war in Eastern Europe. Both candidates have largely diverged on this issue. Former President Trump has really remained quite blurry surrounding his policies. He said he would end the war in a day if he was elected. Could you describe the kind of impacts that you believe Trump's proposed plan could, have an impact on Ukraine and the conflict as a whole?
Numerous occasions and interviews he's done in podcasts, television, as well as at his campaigns. Former President Trump has discussed that he knows Russian President Vladimir Putin very well and that they get along. And he has continuously repeated that he would end the Russian invasion of Ukraine in a day. However, when he was asked about this, especially during the recent debate with him and Vice President Harris, he did not specify what this plan entails. If he was to force Ukraine into a peace agreement with Russia, this would mean that millions of Ukrainians in the Russian occupied regions of southern and eastern Ukraine would be forced under Russian occupation. And the significance of that is during the last 2.5 years during the war, the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and several other organizations have conducted research and note all the atrocities that the Russians are committing against Ukrainian nationals, as well as other ethnic minority groups within Ukraine, such as raping and torturing children and women, executing civilians who are not in the battlefield, creating mass graves. They're, of course, beyond what they've been doing in these villages and towns that are hard to reach. So by forcing the Ukrainians into an agreement with Russia, which is something actually the Ukrainians would not agree to because they have repeated on numerous occasions that the only way to end the war is to force the Russians entirely out of their country. A plan that President Trump has proposed would condemn millions of Ukrainians in the area.
So on the topic of Russia and Ukraine, let's go to the other hand. We have Vice President Kamala Harris, who has been with the Biden administration for the last 4 years, and she has explained that she strongly supports, furthering aid to Ukraine in the form of weapons, munitions, further military aid. What kind of role do you think this conflict has played on her and her candidacy, and what kind of effects can we expect if she is elected?
Vice President Harris to date has met with President Zelensky on 7 occasions now. They speak rather frequently to talk about the ongoing Russian invasion. Something that she attended over the summer was there was a peace summit for Ukraine in Switzerland, where delegates from over 100 countries attended and talked about what would it look like for the war to end and how to help reconstruct and rebuild Ukraine in a post-war situation where the war has ended. And she, like President Biden, has continued to say that the United States will continue to do what it can and however long it takes to assist the Ukrainians to ensure that they are victorious. And she is very supportive of the Ukrainian people. Most recently, when President Zelensky met with Vice President Harris, there was a change in language where Vice President Harris was saying that the United States is now committed to help Ukraine prevail in the war. And that's a recent change over the last 2.5 years.
Let's move on to the other major conflict on the topic here, on the topic of foreign policy here, that in many people's arguments, especially for the non-committed movement, will play a huge impact on Kamala Harris, but also Donald Trump in this election, and that is the ever-broadening war in the Middle East. Israel has gone to war against Hamas, which is its internal enemy, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, had airstrikes within Syria, and has also struck Iran and is expected to strike Iran over the coming weeks. Both Harris and Trump have expressed a very heavy, unwavering commitment to the security of Israel. But we'll start with Kamala Harris. She has differed from Trump in saying she believes a two-state solution can occur between Palestine and Israel. Could you start by detailing the kind of impacts that we've seen on both candidates thus far on the topic of Israel and Gaza, and what kind of things might we see depending on which candidate is elected?
So, as you stated, the Biden-Harris administration is sending aid to both people in Gaza and Israel, further outlining that they do want a two-state solution. And that there recently have been discussions about that Israel has the right to defend itself, but the atrocities and the events that are happening in Gaza are also unacceptable. How civilians are being treated and unfortunately caught in the middle of the war. Furthermore, the administration has condemned some of the attacks that not only the terrorist groups are conducting against the Israeli people and the Israeli government, but also there have been warnings from the United States about how Israel is using aid on territories within the operations where the terrorist groups are working. And they have pushed, they want ceasefires, they want the war to end. This is a very large, tragic conflict. Meanwhile, former President Trump has said that Prime Minister Netanyahu should do everything that is necessary for Israel to do, and he has not spoken out about what is happening with the Palestinians and other Arabs within the region. And it is also important to note that when former President Trump was in charge of the United States, he had issued a ban on several of these Arab countries, preventing citizens from the countries entering the United States. So if he was elected, it is possible that he would try to implement again some of these plans that he had. In addition, when he was in charge, he worked with Israel to force agreements with countries such as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. And if he was elected, it is likely that former President Trump would also try to elevate Israel's status within the region and try to create similar forced agreements with Israel and other countries in that area.
We'll move away from those two major hot button foreign policy issues and more onto the issues of adversaries abroad,
Mhm.
namely China, Iran, and North Korea, as well as many other countries, including Russia, which we previously talked about, have been seen by some people within the US as adversaries. Do you think that any of those aforementioned countries, will play a major role in either candidate's platform or electability ahead of the election?
So something I would educate and encourage the listeners to do is it's publicly available. You can find it on any search platform, is looking up the Democratic National Platform as well as the Republican National Platform that were issued this summer when the candidates were confirmed. When reviewing the Democratic National Platform, Russia and Ukraine are mentioned numerous times, and how the Democrats, if they're elected, would try to undermine Russian meddling and fight against Russian aggression around the world. They also discuss on Chinese influence and how the international community is working together to prevent Chinese work. And they also discuss the Israel Gaza with Hamas and their plans. And it's very, very well detailed, and there's a lot of information there. In contrast, the Republican National Platform is very not specific with how it would address and discuss these matters. And I apologize because I'll get the page numbers wrong, but the Democratic platform is something like 96 pages and the Republican one is 20. So it shows that there's a very different focus. The Republican one has more discussions on domestic policy and issues that are occurring. And while the Republicans have said that countries such as Russia and China are adversaries to the United States, Russia's not mentioned once, and in the document platform issued by the Republicans, and China's mentioned very few times. In addition, the FBI and DOJ have conducted a lot of research and they have warned both political campaigns that there will be election meddling in the cycle. They've also noted that over the summer there was an Iranian group that had accessed and gained information from the Trump campaign. There have been warning signs that Russia is using social media as well as artificial intelligence to invent and spread misinformation about both political parties and putting out remarks and videos and images that simply did not occur or are fabricated to try to sway opinions. And this is very done well strategically, and especially states that will be swing states this election where voter rights will have a very important role in who is elected in 2 weeks' time. And the Russians and the Iranians are trying to undermine the free and fair election process within the United States, which is very concerning.